Dan, welcome to Mint Season 6. What's up, man? How are you doing? Thank you for being on.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on the podcast. A lot is going on in the Web3 social space, and what better person to talk to than the one who's building Farcaster, right? I've been on Farcaster. A lot of people use Farcaster. A lot of excitement across crypto Twitter that also now migrates to Farcaster and vice versa. So, a lot to talk about. I want to start with you, though, okay? Who are you? What does the world need to know about you? And more specifically, how'd you get your start into crypto?
Yeah, so I think my background, I'm originally from Massachusetts. I went to school on the East Coast, worked in Boston for a bit, and then eventually moved to Silicon Valley.
Okay.
I started on the operational side of things, so didn't study something technical in undergrad. I grew up kind of always with computers, programming, kind of, mucking around with the internals of stuff, but for whatever reason, didn't major in it in college. But when I moved out to Silicon Valley, I had worked in consulting, so kind of got a job more on the operational side of things. And I was working at a SaaS company that does visitor sign-in software for iPads. And I just kept hearing about Bitcoin from all of the smart people I had started to meet in the Bay Area. And I realized I didn't have my own point of view on it. And actually, if you back up, when I first moved to Silicon Valley, a college classmate of mine, Fred Ursum, one of the co-founders of Coinbase, heard that I was moving out, reached out, we got coffee, mentioned they had just raised a Series A for Coinbase and were looking to kind of hire out the first few employees. And I categorically dismissed him, thinking that Bitcoin was a Ponzi scheme. Why would you be spending your time on that? Why don't you work on a real tech company? Fast forward a year later, I actually had read the white paper finally and couldn't stop thinking about Bitcoin. And I think that the thing that got me most excited about Bitcoin in the kind of early days, enough to make the switch over to Coinbase, was thinking about it as a computing layer and kind of thinking about, if you think about like computing history, you kind of go from mainframes to the kind of like, okay, PCs, then you add the internet, then you add mobile, and then you start to go away from the local machine to the cloud. And so each one of these new platforms offers really interesting opportunities for entrepreneurs and to build new products and experiences, mobile being the most recent. And in 2014, I thought, okay, Bitcoin is clearly that next computing platform, right? You can start to do new experiences that don't live within a centralized database. And the first applications of that being money and payments. And so I joined Coinbase very much thinking it was going to be all about the new apps that were going to be built on top of the Coinbase API, which ended up being wrong. And I'm happy to talk through my experience at Coinbase
Mm-hmm.
and what I learned there. But so I kind of went in with a very naive point of view and then stuck around for 5 years. And in many ways got lucky in the sense that the market shifted and something like Ethereum came along and the company did end up doing well. But I always like to point out that I joined Coinbase with the completely wrong thesis for what was going to be big, at least for Bitcoin. And I think we're finally actually starting to play out with some of the ideas that I originally were excited about in 2014. But that's how I get started in crypto.
What were some of those original ideas that now you're sort of seeing get played out right now?
Well, the ideas that there was like one very concrete idea that I got excited about was
Okay.
prediction markets.
Okay.
And there was a paper from the Mercatus Center. I think Jerry Brito, who now runs Coin Center, was still in academia, and he wrote it, just talking about the history of different prediction markets from a theoretical standpoint. And I've always just found that to be fascinating. I'm a bit of a political news junkie, and so the idea that you could kind of use markets to predict elections better than polling is I've always found intellectually interesting. And so that they talked about potentially using Bitcoin because one of the fundamental issues is in the US, if you want to offer a prediction market, that's considered a derivative, which is regulated by the CFTC. And there's a notable example of a company that wanted to do a prediction market specifically for Hollywood movies. It's called Hollywood Exchange. They raised a bunch of funding, built out a
Oh yeah.
product, and they went to go launch this product, which essentially would allow you to bet on what the box office receipts for a movie would be. And Hollywood crack down by doing a bunch of lobbying in DC, which ultimately got the CFTC to shut it down because they didn't want people to be betting, especially insiders, to be betting on whether a movie was going to flop or not, because then you would start using that information as a consumer to potentially not go see that movie because people thought it would be bad.
Right.
Which is kind of interesting if you think about it from a consumer benefit standpoint. That Hollywood exchange would be great. For Hollywood, it would be bad in the sense that they couldn't really package up bad movies and try to promote them. But CFTC decided that wasn't allowed, and so that doesn't exist. There's actually now an exchange in the kind of more fintech world that is not crypto related called Kalshi, and they are one of the first kind of more consumer oriented prediction markets that have found some amount of CFTC approval, or at least the set of markets that they're doing. But I think that the other thing that I just generally got excited about in crypto is regulated markets are fine. And if, Coinbase, the experience I had there, we did a lot with regulation and you have to get it right. And it actually ends up creating a lot of value for a business because not a lot of people want to do it. Some people call that regulatory capture, but there's a kind of aspect of the internet that I've always been interested in is permissionless innovation. And I think the ethos of the internet is if you have a good idea, you should, and a computer and the capability to program something, you should just be able to do it. And with fintech, it's much more, okay, if you can go convince people to raise money, then you can go build out like a special relationship with whether it's banks or card processing companies, and then you can put an API on top of that, right? A company like Stripe or a company like Plaid has done an excellent job at managing that, and actually by virtue of them being very developer oriented, have significantly increased the number of apps that exist in the world of fintech, because each of those kind of apps that sit on top of a Plaid or a Stripe, they don't have to go do those relationships directly, right? But what's neat about crypto is you don't even need the middleman. The APIs and the data and the value are directly accessible to the end user as well as the developer. Right. And I think that concept of removing a huge chunk of kind of like intermediaries is just like a concept that I think is really fascinating and frankly one of the most compelling reasons to work in technology for me is you can actually build these things on the internet that can exist as protocols that create coordination between humans, but not necessarily any one individual or company owns it.
So is that where social comes into the picture? Because of the things that you said that interest you, you didn't bring up social media as like the keyword sort of within that entire explanation. And I'm curious, like, where does social fit into that vision of yours? That excitement?
Yeah, I think 2014, I wasn't thinking about social as a crypto thing in that, when I first started at Coinbase, we were Bitcoin only and the push was payments, which ended up, again, not quite playing out. And what Coinbase ended up becoming is more of an investment platform, but also a gateway into being able to take Bitcoin or ETH and then put it into whether it's DeFi or any kind of permissionlessly built app on top of these blockchains. So that's an important function, right? It's not just purely financial exposure. But in 2014, at least when I was joining Coinbase, I think that was right around when Twitter was potentially hamstringing the API. But prior to that, Twitter had a very open API. And so you had a very diverse ecosystem of third-party clients. I like to always point out that the pull to refresh, the kind of universal of, whether you're using a mail client today or Instagram to just refresh your feed, that was invented by a third-party indie developer, Lauren Brichter, who had an app called Tweety, which eventually ended up selling to Twitter. And then Twitter technically owns the patent for pull to refresh. And they did something that's quite honorable. They kind of said, hey, we'll never prosecute anyone from using it. But that was an era where I think that there was still a lot of promise in social media as potentially this API-driven, yes, there were going to be kind of first-party clients, but third-party clients, there could be a diverse ecosystem, especially for something like Twitter. Fast forward to 2022, I think we're in a far different state of the world related to social networks, social media, in that they are more centralized. There are, I think, a stricter set of guidelines in terms of what's acceptable use versus not. And I think in some ways, there are some good aspects of that, but at the same time, I think it's kind of wild if you think about something like Twitter. You have a bunch of people in San Francisco making decisions on what is acceptable speech or
Right.
use for the entire world, which is wild, right?
Right.
Whereas something like the internet, again, it's country by country, but to me, that's a much more credibly neutral platform in the sense that the US has strong free speech laws. So if you maintain your own website and you don't fall afoul of a very limited set of things that would violate free speech, that's on you and or you and your hosting provider.
Right.
Whereas if you live in another country that maybe has stricter limits on speech, that's your version of the internet. But what's neat is it kind of is global, and you as an individual, if you can either get outside of your country or maybe have a pseudonymous way of publishing, you really can get access to the direct level of the protocol. Whereas with these social networks, you're much more limited in terms of where that company's leadership and jurisdiction is for the company, and then that kind of propagates out to the rest of the world. And so I think where my thinking from 2014 to 2020, 2022 era has changed is we've gotten significantly more centralized with social media and social networks. They're significantly larger and more present in terms of just public discourse. And I think we're starting to see the seams where they can't scale at this level and maintain some of the core original promises that they had. If you go back to the early product marketing for Twitter, is they were very pro free speech. Like that was actually their differentiator as, hey, Twitter is a place to be able to express what you think, whether you're in the US or, I don't know, a country in the Middle East. The whole Arab Spring was a moment for Twitter, at least in that moment. And I think that's changed quite a bit. And the question is like, as society, should we have a neutral public square protocol that allows us to do some of the things that centralized social media is significantly better than kind of open protocols, right? So the open protocols here would be the web, email, RSS. But can you actually take some of the best aspects of centralized social media from the usability standpoint, discoverability, and actually bring those into something that looks more credibly neutral, like a more traditional internet protocol? And so that's the thing that I got excited about and why I'm working on it now.
Interesting. So I think we're seeing an increase of like sudden adoption across Web3 social applications, whether it be from people trying to build applications to users trying to use these applications or creators trying to create content and monetize through these applications. And I'm still trying to understand the space from like a macro lens. I'm curious to hear your point of view. What do you think is the current state of Web3 social?
We're early. I think there are a variety of different approaches. There are probably more additional networks that pop up and people with different points of view on how to do things. We are also in a slightly different situation compared to maybe some other technology trends, in that if you take the examples of Twitter and Facebook, they were kind of in that first generation of social media, the Web 2 social media boom. And so a lot of the stuff was getting figured out for the first time, for the most part, right? Because yeah, you had some earlier social networks, Friendster,
right,
MySpace, but the inflection point was really as society shifted over to mobile as being the dominant form factor. That actually massively increases the amount of social media use, right? Rather than being something that, I'm gonna go sit on my computer and use Facebook, versus being on the couch watching TV and also having Facebook open.
Right.
And so I think with Web3, you're not in a situation where you're competing mostly against greenfield, like in that you are in a greenfield situation. You're competing against mature Web 2 social networks for time spent, right? And so if you think about social, it's a zero-sum game in that you only have a limited amount of time. You can't spend time on two social networks at once. So if you're spending it on one social network or watching Netflix, that's the trade-off. And so I think where Web3 social is early days in terms of infrastructure development, both the protocol layer as well as app development on top, but also in the kind of figuring out what's the differentiator versus the mature options that basically everyone is already on, right? It's not like people are onboarding to social media for the first time with Web3 social. They're already on Web2 social media. And if anything, that's actually where you're finding a lot of those people as a developer of a Web3 social media product. But the the challenge is okay, I already have a big audience on Web2 social media. I have the habit. I've spent time curating my feed. I like the algorithmic stuff that I'm getting. Maybe you don't. But to then actually get everything up and running in Web3, that's where we really are right now. It's can you actually offer something that is reasonably competitive, such that someone is willing to trade off time spent over here in Web3, and so that's actually something that we've been really focused on for the last 2 years, is building the initial client for Farcaster, the protocol. Because from our point of view, the thing that's actually going to drive the most switching is you have to have a base level of feature parity, right? You can't say, hey, this is a really rough app, but it's decentralized. No one's going to switch to that. Whereas if you can get a mobile app that from a performance standpoint feels pretty close, maybe not quite there, and then a sufficient number of kind of people that are interesting, then you might start to get the early adopters who say, oh, this is actually kind of nice. It's the spam bots aren't here, or I actually have more control over what I see in my feed. But I think that's a pretty slow process.
Right.
Whereas maybe fast forward 2 or 3 years from now, and you have a variety of attempts in Web3 social that have kind of gotten that first stage done, you may start to see actually apps grow at a faster clip, a more mainstream audience clip. But I think where we are right now is in that kind of early adopter deployment phase. And then you have this kind of challenge of like, okay, well, how do you cross that chasm to mainstream? Right. But I actually think it's like you need to focus on the first phase first before you even worry about the mainstream. Right. I think there are a lot of people who, when they think Web3 social, and I think NFTs in a positive way kind of increase the aperture of what crypto can be for people, rather than this kind of like very finance, quantitative, numeric thing. There's a visual element, a very consumer element. Yes, there's a financial element to it. But I think as a result of that, a lot of people, especially with the kind of bull market of 2021, wanted to proclaim, okay, this is crypto's mainstream moment. And I can tell you, having worked in crypto since 2014, people have been saying this is crypto's mainstream moment for way 8 too years. And I think it's just the wrong frame, right? I don't think we get to a sudden, okay, this is now mainstream.
Right.
Because I think the analogies people like to use, oh, this is like 1993 and now we have Netscape that's going to kind of kick off this adoption. Mm-hmm. The difference is there was no internet before. Whereas now with crypto, it's a subset of the internet. So inevitably, like, it isn't a step function of a change for a consumer. If you just kind of the simple thing of, okay, I can get an Uber with Uber, or someone goes build the centralized Uber, you still get the Uber. Whereas pre-internet, there was no Uber, taxis or whatever. Right. But the step function change is the 0 to 1. And I think where crypto is always fairly or unfairly compared is this. I think when people are being unreasonable, they're trying to say it's a step function change when it's probably more incremental. And I think that's even the wrong frame to be thinking about as an entrepreneur, because I actually think what's interesting is if you can just actually shift to say what new experiences or things that are fundamentally not possible in Web2 can you actually start to build. And so that's one of the first principles in terms of building that we've approached with Farcaster is use the amount of Web2 or Web3 as minimal as possible. Like the amount of stuff we put on chain is as small as possible, and then leverage everything else from Web2 that's great in terms of usability and speed and all of that. Mm-hmm. And see if you can actually start to get to a fundamentally new experience. And in our case, it's a social network where the back end is truly a protocol and is permissionless. And then figure out, okay, how do you scale that from there without trying to say that everything is fundamentally better? Because to be totally frank, like it's not. Like our client for Farcaster is like pretty good, but it is not as good as something like Twitter yet. And so there's a lot of work to do.
But I think that's okay, because just like having an open brainstorm session, I just reached, I feel like, a stage on Twitter. I just crossed 10K followers. Okay. And as a creator, as a content creator, like that's like a pivotal moment for me and for many other creators. Right. But I still like going to these other platforms because they act as pockets of information, and they act as like pockets of like reset. Right. Like I feel like there's too much going on sometimes on these mainstream platforms. Whereas in these new social platforms, it's like things are just like starting to cook up, right? Like it's not there. And the types of conversations you see having on those platforms are different than the conversations you have on the mainstream platforms, right? So I see from like an information pocket point of view, right? Another thing that's super interesting is like, I know you're big on history, right? And also the way you speak, I noticed like you reference a lot of like learning lessons and insights that you sort of developed and picked up on like as you saw social media kind of develop. I'm curious, can you share more about like the history around the social graph, right? And if you build a Web3 social graph, like what sort of problems are you aiming to fix, right? Big picture. What did Web2 social graphs do wrong that you think, yeah, like these more open permissionless protocols can do right?
Yeah, so I actually don't think there's a ton of great reading out there. You kind of had to experience some of it, and I was fortunate
Okay.
that I was not super old yet, but I was in high school enough that I really got to see the full rise of Web2 social media. But the kind of things to think about are you have the kind of early version of the internet, which was very much about read, right? So it's like kind of consuming information, weather information, sports scores, stocks. And then as the performance of browsers and broadband connections, you started to move to this kind of interactive model where you could effectively use a web application as in lieu of using desktop software, right? And as that happened, you had the kind of first wave of social networks, Facebook in 2004, Twitter, I think 2006, and a whole bunch of other ones that popped up. But what's interesting is in that era, the primary way of bootstrapping those social graphs, outside of just people kind of friending each other on Facebook specifically because they went to school together, so that was actually gated on email. If you look at some of the growth tactics, this is what I've been told at least, that Facebook used, it was kind of the contact importer from your email address, right? It's like sign in with your Gmail or upload your contact list. And that in of itself kind of was able to create a pretty big graph. And what's interesting about that is, so let's say 10 of my friends had signed up for Facebook and I show up to Facebook because I was in their contact book. Facebook actually had enough information to make a recommendation of here are some potential friends. And I think there's the kind of apocryphal story of, get to the 10 friends is the magic number, then a Facebook user became, right? So that was the Facebook implementation is gate on email based on school, get concentration in those schools, expand out to other schools. And then eventually, once you have all the college students in the US, you can expand out to the rest of the world. And the thing I always like to kind of point out is if you think about it, Facebook stopped being cool the moment it stopped being only for colleges. But because they had created such a high concentration of very engaged users at I think a critical cool juncture for society, right? Everyone younger than a college student thinks they're cool because they're in college, and then people who are graduated from college wish they were back in college.
Right.
And so my theory on that is that concentration of basically college students had this crazy half-life where even if college student engagement started to slowly decline on Facebook, it didn't matter because the rest of the world wanted to kind of go after that original feel, and then you eventually get to several billion people using the app. I mean, a phenomenal success from building a social graph. Twitter, a little different in that it was a little bit more SF tech scene, and the South by Southwest, and it kind of started actually as a slightly older platform relative to, if you look at a lot of social networks, they tend to be younger. And the push with Twitter is, if you actually look at it, it just didn't grow that much in the scheme of things for the first 5 years, and it's only in the last 5-7 years that it's had a significant, like, really big impact on society. It really kind of around the 2016 election, I think Twitter became a lot more mainstream. Obviously, always high status from the hashtag or the @reply, but in terms of Twitter being used as kind of this true internet public square, I think 2016 and after, that's where Twitter, and then part of it is the president was using Twitter directly.
Right.
And so I think that network, I don't have as much insight into exactly how the social graph developed. But that said, I also think one thing to think about with Twitter is not a social network for most people who use it. I think on the order of 200 million people use Twitter every day. What percentage of people are actually tweeting, liking, replying? It's relatively small. Whereas I think most people use Twitter as an information feed and just simply a way to catch up on news. Whereas you or I, the way we use Twitter is this kind of intellectual, thought leadership network where you're meeting other like-minded people in your industry to kind of have a better perspective on whatever you're working on. And that version of Twitter is what it started with, but really has not expanded. We didn't have 100 million people all of a sudden doing threads on Twitter, right? And so that's actually something that's influenced our thinking with Farcaster is if you actually think of the addressable market that you have to go after in order to be something that's competitive with Twitter, that total number of users of the 200 million people using it every day, that's a daunting number and feels like you can never get there. But if you reframe it to say, actually the Twitter version that we're trying to compete with early on is go for the people who use Twitter as kind of this public intellectual social network.
Right.
Then that's a far smaller number and it makes it more achievable, right? Like you go from being barely anyway the percentage of the way there to, okay, maybe you can get to like 0.1% and then to 0.5%, 1%, 10%. And so I think that is a way of reframing what we're going after. And the other interesting thing about people who use Twitter as a social network is they're the ones who hit the problems the most, right? They post about, MetaMask or the future of crypto wallets, and then they get all the crypto spam responding to them, right? You take a lot of time to craft, whether it's a thread or a post for your podcast, and for whatever reason, the algo is like, oh, you put a link. We don't want you clicking on the link because that kicks you out of the app. Okay, right. It gets downrated. And so that is where I think the opportunity for a new social network, at least in the bootstrapping mechanism, it's to go after the people that feel the acute pain points of Twitter. But the challenge with those people, and I think we've talked about this on DM, is you're trying to build an audience. And so you're going to optimize for the platform where you feel like you're going to get the most reach. And so for something like Farcaster, where we're approaching it with this kind of very deliberate growth, invite only 3,000-ish people in a beta, it's going to be hard to justify for you as a content creator to say, hey, I'm going to spend more time on Farcaster because I really want to build my audience. If you feel like there's more potential on either another Web3 social network or realistically something like Twitter. And this is actually an insight that when we launched Farcaster last year, I onboarded a whole bunch of people that I would call are my Twitter friends and people in my professional network. And they had talked a lot about, for a long time about the need for a decentralized version of Twitter. And so I start working on this thing. I'm ready to onboard them. They go through an onboarding with me. They're really, excited. They're like, wow, this is actually pretty decent. Never come back. And I reach out to them and ask, well, why didn't you come back? You told me that you thought this is an important thing. And whether they were willing to admit it or not, I think I finally figured out, and this is obvious in retrospect, but I think you sometimes have to just go through the hard lesson of it,
Sure.
Is if you have 500,000 or 800,000 followers on Twitter and you have 80 followers on a nascent social network, how are you going to justify spending the time on that network out of just pure passion or interest? But those people are busy. So, of course, they're going to default to the thing that has massive distribution because ultimately, if you're playing this kind of public intellectual social network game, what you care about is meme propagation and idea propagation. And so quantity does matter. Now, I think one thing I would say is quality has been very hard to measure traditionally. And I think one interesting thing about a decentralized social network that is crypto native, like Farcaster, is one, you can now have a whole bunch of competing companies have full access to the entire data set, right? So one thing about Twitter, like the proverbial fire hose, I think that's pretty limited in who has access to it. I don't even know if they even give access to it at this point. But the idea is you can't actually do a full measure of the entire network. You have to do sampling, right? Whereas with something like Farcaster, you can just actually index the entire network. Right. And then what's interesting is you can also look at the on-chain activity. And so you can actually use that on-chain activity in two ways I think is interesting. Is one, you can quickly figure out if things look spammy. right? Because it's very expensive to put high value NFT or even $5,000 worth of Ethereum into a whole bunch of addresses to kind of fake an account.
Sure.
Whereas contrast that to a Twitter account, bot account, where
super easy.
I think a lot of times they just need a phone number, which you can programmatically create with VoIP, and so I think that becomes really interesting because you can actually start to measure the quality by whatever metric you want of your audience in a way that in Web 2 you get a little bit of it. Like Facebook can have some centralized reporting tools, but it's pretty general and crude. Whereas I think you get a lot more detail with Web3, and maybe it doesn't always stay the same. Maybe we get a little bit more privacy on chain in terms of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. But I think it's an underexplored area, and I think as we scale Farcaster, I do think people are going to build some interesting tools so that you have a much better understanding of your audience, building on a decentralized crypto native network like Farcaster. And yes, your audience might only be 10% or 1% of your audience on Twitter, but you have higher confidence that it's actually a higher value audience, and an audience that might actually refer your podcast to another friend, right? And so I think that's like one element that we're trying to figure out, because it's just going to be a really long time before we ever kind of reach the level of scale that Web 2 social networks have.
I'm curious, Dan, because I'm trying to figure out like what does it mean to be a crypto native creator, let alone build an audience using like Web3 primitives, right? So one thing that I've been experimenting with is like giving out like NFTs to my listeners as a way to kind of like prove their participation across seasons, right? And over time, like there's been thousands of NFTs that have been minted, and now I'm trying to use that information to create better content for them, right? By seeing like their activity on chain, right? So that I can find better sponsors, etc., find better guests. So if I notice that a lot of people have been, for example, collecting music NFTs, that tells me I should be having more music NFT related conversations. If I see a lot of activity around like Web3 social applications, right, then I want to have more Web3 native social conversations, right? Hence why I did like this season on like Web3 social media, data, like interoperability, etc., right? And I'm trying to figure out still like what does it mean to be a crypto native creator and build an audience in Web3, right? Do you have any insight on that? Like, do you have any opinions on that?
Well, I think you're on the frontier. So what you're coming up with from an idea standpoint is the innovation that enough people doing it, you'll start to come up with the new patterns that may be more crypto native or Web3 native. And so one thing that you mentioned that I think is really interesting is you actually have insight into what your listeners, assuming you kind of correlate listeners on a Web3 social network like Farcaster or other ones, you can actually look at their on-chain activity and then start to glean insights and say, oh, interesting. 100 people who are following me also have the new Reddit avatar that's on Polygon, I think. And maybe I should actually reach out to Reddit and see if I can find the lead engineer or product manager who did that product, as a way for you to offer a more compelling interview that is really relevant to your audience, or at least a portion of your audience. And then that person might not have been interviewed before in terms of like a bigger podcast show that tends to focus on a CEO or something like that.
Right.
And so I think that those insights that you can start to permissionlessly get from your audience may offer better tailored content for your audience or like subset segments of your audience. I also think that the concept of fandom is I'm not nearly as deep as some of the other people in the space who are building dedicated companies to this, but I just think it's a really interesting concept, because if you take crypto and Web3 and put it aside, for as long as music has existed, there's always been that kind of early fan hipster who finds a band, really enjoys them when they're kind of under the radar and really passionate about it. That early passion creates some word of mouth, which creates more, and then that network effect, right? You can kind of model a band like a social network, gets big enough that the band becomes more mainstream, which then brings in even more people. But the original people who were early kind of get disaffected. It's like, oh, I liked them before they got big or they sold out or whatever. And just the idea that there could be a provable way, not even have a financial incentive, just a provable way to say, oh, I used to listen to X artists before they were cool, right? The classic hipster line. And it's like, okay, well, prove it. Like, show me the music NFT, or you get to a level where every Spotify stream somehow is in a decentralized data structure. We're ways away from that if that ever happens. But you can generally understand the concept that provable, skin in the game, historical on kind of an immutable ledger, it starts to open up some new interesting experiences, right? Maybe those artists now can actually say, hey, yeah, we're really big. We do these big stadium tours, but every year we do a concert in New York City at Madison Square Garden for our original 50,000 fans.
Right.
And for the rest of your life, you have access to that concert. That kind of seems interesting. I think you could find someone like a Web 2 person who hates Web 3 is going to go, oh, wait, well, you could have had a fan club and then you could do, fine, yeah, you could do that. But I think like part of the beauty of Web 3 is it changes people kind of to think bigger or new paradigms. And the ability to permissionlessly do that is pretty cool, right? Imagine if you give a free concert to your original 10,000 fans. Don't even need to pay, just show up to the door, show me the NFT. That's it. Like no money exchange hands, just pure brand. Can't do that in Web 2 for the most part, right? Like you'd have to maintain this list and, well, okay, what happens when you want to switch providers? Whereas if it just lives on the blockchain, it doesn't matter. Like that NFT will exist. And so
let alone try to get that information too. Like when a creator builds an audience on like a Web 2 native platform, there's only so much information that they can get access to, right? Whereas in crypto, when you're building these audiences using either tokens or NFTs, social, whatever it may be, right? Like that lives immutably. Like you can always go back to that record. Like one thing that I'm thinking, like at some point as the podcast grows, I can do some type of like David Letterman type of shit where I just like rent out an auditorium and everybody that's sort of collected my early seasonal NFTs, they'll have access to watch like a live interview with us, right? And experience that. Yeah. I think that's really cool. I'm also trying to think from like a monetization point of view. I think we sort of maybe just skim the surface of what monetization looks like. A lot of my bet is that all media will be tokenized to an extent, right? And all media, everything will be collectible to an extent, to in some shape or form. And what does that look like in terms of monetization? So right now, a lot of creators, they measure success from like views on YouTube or subscribes, right? How does that look like in the context of Web3? Does that mean the number of unique holders that you have at scale, right? Does that mean like the number of primary and secondary sales you have? Like how do you measure the success of a creator? I don't know. I'm thinking out loud over here. But
yeah. Well, yeah. I go back to this idea that I think Web 2 is very much about quantity. Everything is about scale, like total number of users. Cristiano Ronaldo has 100 million followers on Instagram, or Kim Kardashian, and that's how you talk about it. And I think Balaji has come up kind of with this concept of like being able to measure a fan economy is a far more interesting thing. So fine, Kim might have 100 million followers on Instagram, but what is the GDP of the Kim Kardashian expanded universe, right? Like if you kind of as a gimmick, but people laugh at that, right? So he was saying this a couple of years ago, and now Kim Kardashian's potentially starting a private equity firm based on the fact that she's going to potentially be able to use that distribution. And so I think that what gets interesting is if you can actually take the distribution out of the silos, like I have this many followers on YouTube, I have this many followers on Twitter, and you move it to kind of these decentralized, credibly neutral kind of core data structures where now the relationship is between the creator, the publisher, whatever, and the people who choose to follow them, right? And that is it's an opt-in relationship, right? Because the person can always unfollow you. It's not like you own that follower forever.
Right.
But the key is that no one can come in and say, oh, you know what, terms of service violation, we've decided that what you said here is no longer acceptable. You've spent 10 years building an audience, tough luck, boom, right? You get kicked off YouTube or Twitter, there's no recourse, there's no exit, there's no, oh, take your followers, here you go, here are all their emails, now you can email them. And so I think if you look at just the way Web 2 social media is you as a creator have to spend way more time of you either take the bet on these platforms will keep you forever, probably fine, or you do the extra effort of, hey, subscribe, also sign up for my newsletter so that I have a direct line of communication with you. Whereas fast forward, if these Web3 social protocols work, you as a creator, you just have a direct relationship. You want to send them a podcast, you want to send them a video, you want to send them a cast, can basically come through a variety of different clients, applications, channels, but that relationship is a single relationship and it belongs to the two people who have opted to be in it, right. Which I think is a pretty radical shift from what we've been used to in Web 2. And that also means you have freedom of monetization, right? So I think the kind of idea space for monetization is just getting started. Not only because you have crypto with this kind of core financial primitive and you can do things like NFTs and DeFi and the remixability and composability of that, but also just the idea that, okay, I can do a traditional subscription and maybe it's done on chain or maybe it's done through Stripe and a traditional Web 2 platform. Fine. I think the challenge is when you are reliant on platforms, and in some cases, platforms that are reliant on other platforms, with the example of like, if you're on YouTube and then Apple iOS, like there are two rent-seeking platforms that want to take dollars before they even get to you.
Right.
And I think the most extreme example was, I think Meta, Oculus, they were trying to do a platform for that. And then they had a Facebook, like Horizons platform cut. And I want to say if you did the thing on an iPhone, it had like an iOS, like it was just like cuts all the way down, right? And what's great about Web3 is like you can actually solidify through a cryptographic proof. Again, the average user doesn't need to see this, but from a developer standpoint, that relationship between the creator and a person in their audience, as well as what also gets interesting, audience to audience connections, right? And so that's another interesting thing that's hard to measure. But if you think about it, if you're, I don't know, Taylor Swift and you want your whole fan club, maybe Taylor Swift is big enough to have like a custom social app that people are willing to even show up to. Whereas most other artists or creators, you're never going to have like a custom app that people are going to use. They're basically, their time spent is in Instagram, their time spent is in Twitter. And so you kind of have to play the game there because that's where the attention is. Whereas I think with these kind of remixable, composable, open access social protocols, I think there's a totally foreseeable future where for the 3 or 5 creators, whether that's, a video creator or a music artist, if I want to have a direct relationship with them, I'm using one of these open protocols because it actually just does a lot of the plumbing for me. And then there's probably some version of, call it WordPress or whatever, where you can or Squarespace, where you can basically as a creator have a mobile app that the user is like, oh, great, this is completely interoperable. So when you post a video, I can get it over here on Twitter, the Twitter one if I want. But if I really want to go deep with everyone else in the community, I can use this token gated app that based on your show, and I can get really, really deep with other people who are members of the show. And we have seen this, by the way, with like the rise of Discords is an indication that there is demand for this. But Discord, which look, tremendous products and success in terms of just scale, but it's imperfect in the sense that it's not really optimized for mobile. It's a gamer product at the end of the day, right? And so it's a very desktop heavy experience. Whereas if you think about it, like when you, as a creator, if you say, hey, I have a Discord and I have 10,000 people in my Discord, you're just like another little icon in this whole long set of, and Discord controls the notifications and all the experience, where you could imagine being, if you're my favorite podcast producer, I can actually now install your app, which didn't take you a lot of effort in the scheme of things, no different than a website because it's using these open protocols. And now you get push notifications on my phone that are completely, direct between you and your audience, and whatever the experience, right? And so that is a ways off, and maybe we don't get there. I'm a big believer that we will, but I think you need to get the infrastructure in place first before entrepreneurs start to say, oh, this has become a commodity, or this has become this kind of credibly neutral infrastructure that I know I can actually go build these apps for these different creators because this protocol is going to have some level of stability, right? And I think the example here is obviously email is an example of a protocol that if I really wanted to take the brain damage and go build my own email client, right, Superhuman being the most recent, you can do it. And there's you don't have to ask the email consortium for permission. If you understand SMTP and IMAP, like it'll just work. And what's actually even kind of neat is you can build an email client that works with Google And Google, just because, at least in the email world, kind of has to support IMAP because it's kind of the de facto standard. They don't even really get to say, it's like, oh wait, so I can actually build on top of your backend and you did all the hard part and just build a better client, which is what I think Superhuman is today, right? Like they don't even handle the like low level email plumbing. They're just an IMAP client or a deeper integration with Google.
Sure.
But I think that like becomes a pretty powerful thing where if more stuff in social actually has that level of like permissionless innovation, and in the case of the building on Google, that's not even permissionless. It's like mostly permissionless.
Right.
I think you just yield a whole bunch of more interesting experiences, which gets back to this monetization thing is I think we're just scratching the surface. It's just to say, oh, well, we'll have ad-based, we'll have subscriptions, and then we'll have some amount of, NFTs. I think you're just at the start. It's like looking at the internet in 1994 and predicting all of the different business models and new companies that have come out of it.
Right. One thing that Farcaster tends to be very public about in their branding and their image is that it's a sufficiently decentralized social network. And I think when you come back to it and you ask yourself, like, what does it mean to be sufficiently decentralized? And I'm sure you get this question all the time. I'm curious, what is the answer to that? Like, what is decentralized on Farcaster? How do you make decisions on what to decentralize versus centralize? Like, share with me your entire mental model around that.
So the way to think about how sufficiently decentralized works is there's a spectrum between centralized and decentralized in terms of an application, right? And in a centralized application, most common example is a company runs a set of APIs. The company decides who uses those APIs, can revoke the API keys at any point. And that's basically Twitter. There is no adjudication process for getting back on Twitter. If Twitter doesn't want you on Twitter, tough luck, right? Same thing goes for the developer. So Twitter has a bunch of APIs. In a prior era, they were much more open. They changed over time. And so that is very much the centralized approach. Other side of things, decentralized, right? So something like SMTP for email, Git is another good example of one, right? Like I can go build a competitor to GitHub and I don't have to ask GitHub for permission and it'll work out of the box because Git is a decentralized protocol that does not have kind of like a corporate owner, right? But the challenge when you start to get out on the decentralized side of things is the user experience tends to get very technical and way worse, right? You just need to know how to do everything. RSS is a good example of that, right? So to use RSS, you need to know, oh, I need to have a feed reader. And it's like, oh, I have a feed reader and I need to keep all of my subscriptions in place. And so the protocol itself tends to be the thing that is more decentralized. And then the spectrum in between is where you can get to something what we'd call sufficiently decentralized. And so for our point of view, rather than start with decentralized and work your way to centralization, it's actually start with centralization and then work your way on the spectrum to decentralization to the point where you can satisfy two conditions. The first is, in the case of a social network, any user can have a direct relationship with another user and no one can take them away like that away from them, right? So if you and I want to be connected, there's no third party that can come in and say, nope, sorry, you can't be connected. The most extreme example of that, obviously, is if you have 100 million followers on Twitter or YouTube, and the platform comes in and says, sorry, you don't have a relationship with those followers anymore. So the kind of user-to-user relationship or creator-to-audience relationship, that is a core primitive, in my view, for what decentralization is. And then the second thing is the access for developers, right? So if I want to go build on the data set here and the APIs, there shouldn't be a single individual or company that can come around and say, sorry, terms of service change, we're going to really actually monetize the advertising. And sorry, your app doesn't work anymore. And so from our standpoint, the way to accomplish that is the thing that needs to be decentralized is effectively the identity, which is two parts. The first is an ID number, right? So every person on social media is represented by an internal number in a database, is just an ID. And one nice feature of that is on Twitter, you can upgrade your username and you don't lose your followers, right? It's not like people were following Dan Romero before, and when I switched to DWR, I lost all of them. It's because the way Twitter maps follows is just to that ID number, right? And then the second thing is the username, which that is much more of a status symbol and a kind of what represents how you interact on these networks. And so if you can remove that from any corporate company and API, it allows any user to choose whatever client they want and not have to worry about lock-in or anything like that. And I think an analogy here is Bitcoin and ETH. When you put it on a company like Coinbase, Coinbase is a centralized company over here, right? Coinbase can choose to kick you off Coinbase. But when Coinbase kicks you off Coinbase, you don't lose your Bitcoin or ETH. We call it, mandatory account closure. That's what happens with Coinbase for some compliance reason. They don't take your money from you. They say, where do you want your money sent? Like, we don't want to do business with you anymore. But you, as the user, have the ability to exit and then interoperate with everything else in the ecosystem, right? It's not like special Coinbase Bitcoin. It's like, this is real Bitcoin, and I can move that to FTX. I can move it to a self-hosted wallet. Same thing goes for a social network. So if in the totally centralized version, you get kicked off, there is no ability to exit and then interoperate with the same graph. You have to effectively rebuild it, right? Another example of this, and that's actually more relevant for social media, is email. So if I have a Substack, and for whatever reason, I might not want to use Substack anymore as a publisher, or Substack doesn't want to host my content, there is no confusion that the email subscriber list that I have belongs to me, right? And if I take that list and I move to a self-hosted option or a competing newsletter provider, I have uninterrupted access to my subscribers that I worked hard to build that relationship with. And so in our point of view, that's the only thing you actually need to focus on, the decentralization. Everything else, you can actually have it be the primary way people deal with stuff is in a centralized client, right? And the benefit you get from that is the centralized client is going to offer vastly superior user experience because the economies of scale that start to happen, you probably have cloud-based services, versus if you use the truly decentralized client where you have to host everything yourself, you're now dealing with what happens when my client goes down or the host doesn't work, or I have to now upgrade it because there's like a vulnerability in the Node.js package that's in the open source software. Like the user experience is significantly worse. And that the easy answer is, why do most people use Gmail and they don't run their own mail server? It's just because it just works. It's easy, right? And what's interesting about Gmail is, you have a Gmail address, that's not exit with interoperability. If you have your own domain and you use G Suite, you can move to a different host, right? Because you own the domain and you can just change where it's pointed. But if you have a Gmail address and you get really attached to that Gmail address, Gmail is not allowing you to move that to Yahoo and say, okay, well, the Gmail address now belongs with this client over here. Generally, I think Google's pretty good in that you can use other clients that sit on top of it. But the relationship you do have with Gmail is they're looking at all your emails and mining it for data, right? For whatever advertising purposes they want to do. That's part of it being free. But I think that the core of that sufficient decentralization is find the thing that you need to be able to get to be a decentralized point, keep that decentralized, and then let the market develop in a way that you're going to have centralized clients that people opt into, and then people can choose more decentralized clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like, Dan, we need to have like a 3-hour long podcast episode, because I've maybe asked 3 questions in this entire 53 minutes, and I'm impressed with how much you have to say around such
probably
simple
be too verbose.
Yeah, but I wanna jump to some community questions that we had come across Twitter, Farcaster, etc. Okay, so this one comes from Martin. Okay, how do you see clients for Farcaster evolving, plus monetization plans in the future? And we can even do this like fire rounds kind of thing.
Yeah. We have the initial client. I think we've been building it for 2 years. It's hit a certain level of polish, usability. We have a mobile client, desktop client. So we've done a lot of work to kind of make it easy to onboard to Farcaster, the protocol. Everyone who onboards so the company is named Merkle Manufacturing, Farcaster is the protocol. Anyone who onboards to a Merkle Manufacturing client has this really nice, easy experience, gets in, now they're active on Farcaster, which now also means that they're an addressable user for anyone who wants to build within the Farcaster ecosystem, because now as a developer building a new client or experience, I don't have to worry about going to convince someone to sign up for Farcaster. I already know that they're there. I can actually just kind of focus on, okay, here are the active users. Let me try to market my product or go to market in terms of that. And by the way, you can post in the feed and people will respond and you know that they're native Farcaster users, right? So there's some built-in distribution there, which as we add more users to the protocol, then the distribution gets better. The natural place for clients to start, which has already happened, is simple view clients that are kind of just doing read-only operations, right? So most of the apps that have been built in the Farcaster ecosystem today have been kind of read-only, where they index all the data or rely on a third-party indexer and then are able to show kind of a specialized view. So an example of this is Instacaster shows all of the posts on Farcaster that have an image in it. Pretty straightforward, pretty interesting UI, relatively easy to boot up. But right now, it doesn't have the ability to also use that client to then post back an image into Farcaster. We've been doing a lot of upgrades to the underlying protocol over the last few months. We're going to hopefully get there and offer a much easier way for a developer to actually now go from just read access to both read write. Mm-hmm. And that write access is where I think you're going to start to see people do two things. So the first is actually just, okay, I'm going to be a specialized client that does something really well. I don't know, maybe surfaces all the questions on Farcaster, all the recommendations, and it shows it in a slightly different way. And anytime you take an action there, maybe you like something, it kind of propagates back into the protocol, and then it would reflect in that kind of like feed experience for other users. Those are probably the easiest place to start because they're smaller projects. Maybe you can do them over a weekend or a week, and you start from there. I think that the longer term, you'll have people building completely new social experiences and using Farcaster to bootstrap the social graph and all of those interactions, the likes, the replies, because it can kind of get it out of the box for free. But those are apps that probably need a larger number of people. The more substantial apps probably start to exist when you have 10x or even 100x the number of users, right? So today we have about 3,000 people using Farcaster. It's a private beta, invite only, been really deliberate about growth. So maybe 10x or 100x from here, 30,000 to 300,000. That's where you start to get developers who go, okay, maybe it's actually worth me testing out this kind of weird social idea I have on this network, because that gets them at least enough potential users that if you get 10% of them, now you at least have an early user base that you can play around with. And as the overall protocol grows, I think that the sophistication of the apps will get more and more sophisticated. And I think the natural way to monetize for these different apps is as the network gets more scale, I think you're going to see naturally apps do free with ads or something. But I do think in the early days, and part of this might be a norm set by our client, we plan to use subscriptions as the primary way to do monetization, because we actually think it aligns the values that we are hoping to have in terms of what the network should be, as this kind of a little bit more sophisticated pro feeling network versus lowest common denominator scale of maybe some of the Web 2 social networks. And the other nice thing is that it aligns how we build the product with what our users want versus how to get them to spend more time so they see more ads, right? So
interesting.
Every subscriber we have, essentially you can think of it as like Amazon Prime, where what Amazon is constantly trying to do is they're trying to find other things that they can add to the Prime bundle that make Prime subscriptions that much more valuable to their subscribers. Right? It's this kind of drive more value. Same thing for Netflix, right? Netflix is looking, how can we add better and more interesting content for the same price that we're charging for people? But that is a fundamentally different model than something like Facebook and Twitter. They have to keep users happy enough, but there's always that kind of tension where they can dial up the amount of ads in the feed or just do whatever they want because they're ultimately focused on time spent. Right. Good example of this recently is Instagram, because of TikTok, is pushing Reels. The revealed preference, by the way, is people love algo feeds, despite what people complain. But the push is a result of you are trying to actually compete in a zero-sum world of time spent between TikTok and Instagram. And so doing the kind of change is you're focused on what gets our users to spend more time versus is this actually what people want? And it's a hard thing because, again, the revealed preference is people actually do like algo feeds. But I would say it's a slightly different model for us in that you can imagine that the average person is spending 10 minutes a day on Farcaster. We may actually launch a feature that maybe it's algorithmic, machine learning, or just filters that allow people to be more efficient in finding whatever they're looking for in Farcaster when they look at the feed, that it reduces the time spent from 10 minutes to 9 minutes and 30 seconds. In an advertising-based business, probably not a good thing, right? Because the amount of time you spend is probably correlates with how many ads you see. Whereas in a subscriber-based business, you could argue that that is actually providing more value to the customer because now what they got is they got 30 seconds back as a result of it being higher signal or more efficient for them, right? So thinking of it as like a tool versus this kind of almost like competitor to television of like, we just want you to spend time here and then look at a bunch of ads, I think is something that we're going to try to experiment with. But if it works, I do think it sets an ethos in the ecosystem, at least for the early adopters and I think the more pro users, the people who are using the network as this kind of public intellectual social network, that I bet you if you could actually go back in time, if Twitter could choose a different monetization path, they probably would have done this instead of trying to kind of always be this Facebook that never has the same scale or the ability to do the targeting. And I actually think their business would be in a fine place today compared to basically it's a public company that has never made a single, like the total cumulative amount of profit is negative as a public company. And part of that is also that I think they're overstaffed. There's like 8,000 people that work there and you can't solve the spam bot problem. But part of that also might be a set of incentives is that you don't want top line numbers in an advertising-based business to go down. Maybe a little cynical on that. But my point being is I think clients in a new ecosystem in 2022 may find success with subscriptions, thinking of themselves more as tools, accessing this kind of public social network data set versus we need to kind of be this lock-in and everything needs to be in the mothership.
Right.
So that's one way I'm thinking about it.
Okay, a couple more questions. How do we beat the bots?
I tweeted this recently. I think Twitter could do this tomorrow if they really wanted to just take the hit on their total number of users. And I think we'll plan to do this with Merkle Manufacturer's clients. Phone number, credit card on file. So don't charge them, but maybe do a one-time charge of $1 so you have that. Coinbase, we asked for a passport, so you could do another thing. And I think that there should just be a set of steps, 5 steps to get verified, and that's how you get a blue check, not your celebrity or you work at some media organization or whatever. Or maybe have 2 different types of checks, right? But I bet you a ton of people would go through the friction if they spend a lot of time on Twitter to get that check mark, especially if you could say, hey, the algorithm will boost anyone who's verified. And explicitly, we will not show replies from unverified people. You can use Twitter as an unverified way, like as a consumption mechanism. But if you want to participate in the conversation, you need to go through a little bit of vetting. So to me, that's what we do on Merkle Manufacturer, and then you don't have bots. Plus, it costs money to register a Farcaster username because there's an on-chain.
Right. Are there Akil BVS asks, are there any plans to roll out incentives to build on top of Farcaster to attract developers? What sort of new apps with social primitives / use cases do you think builders can build?
Well, to the second part of that question is the world's your oyster. If I could invite every new social app, I would probably pick the new primitive to go after because it's a lot easier to grow if you have a viral new primitive. That said, I think incentives, that's something that we've tried a little bit. So we had a couple of people build early apps last, in the spring, and we offered them kind of a one-time block grant, no strings attached for the summer, and just to kind of defray server costs and encourage them to keep building the apps that they were doing. That worked pretty well. So I think that we probably will do something along those lines. I think what's important though is people show organic interest, and there's no promises like, oh, if I build something, you're going to give me a grant. It's more of a know when you see a good faith effort, which maybe doesn't scale, but I think aligns you much more towards a organic community versus a strictly paid for mercenary community. Mm-hmm. So I think we want to avoid that part, but there's probably a pretty optimal trade-off. Okay. And I think going back to the ideas, the one thing I think that I'm excited about is one primitive that every user on Farcaster has is a private key. So it's the first network that just by itself, you signing up for a Farcaster username, you have a public and private key. Even something like Signal, you have to actually verify with the phone number. And so you can imagine the amount of encrypted or zero knowledge, if you want to get more technical on the crypto side, types of experiences that you can permissionlessly build as a developer, knowing that every single user on Farcaster, in order for them to even be on Farcaster, have to have a private key that's hot, right, live. I think is an idea space that someone will build something really interesting. And to use a framework that I think a lot of people talk about, generally social networks that succeed offer some new type of speech or new primitive that enables people to communicate in a new way. And I think that entire space of new encrypted experiences and new zero knowledge experiences is completely undertapped, partially because it's cutting edge technology, right? Like you have to really understand it. It has not been, there's no Ruby on Rails equivalent for ZK yet. And so I think it'll take some time for that to happen.
Got it. We're way over, but I appreciate you staying a little bit longer, Dan. Before I let you go, how do we get a Farcaster invite? If those listening want to join, and where can we find you?
Yeah, so if you've made it this far, that's proof of work. Proof of work enough that if you DM me on Twitter, DWR, and mention you heard the podcast, I'm happy to send you an invite. I think we're really trying to be deliberate on people who are thoughtful, optimistic, energetic. And if you're spending time listening to a podcast, someone talking about Web3 social, you're probably a good candidate for Farcaster.
Cool. Thank you so much. We'll have to do this again soon. But yeah, until next time.
Cheers.